Hi folks, Todd here. Before today's episode, I wanted to pop a little spoiler warning in here. Percy and I went into more detail than we initially expected so we could accurately talk about Wolfcrush by Haygen-Brice Walker and the Interrobangers by Sloth Levine. If you're looking forward to reading these plays, please pause the podcast and go read them. We'll be here when you get back. Otherwise, listen on. Hello and welcome to Dungeons and Drama Nerds. I'm Todd, and I'm here today with Percy.
Hello.
And we're going to be discussing two plays that we think fall into the kids on bike genre. They are The Interrobangers by Sloth Levine and Wolfcrush by Haygen-Brice Walker.
We thought we would kick it off by just telling you a little bit about these plays. So Wolfcrush by Haygen-Brice Walker tells the story of a small town that is being attacked by some kind of horrible beast in the woods. And it explores the interactions of four teenagers at the local school who are, falling in and out of love, interacting with each other, learning about each other, and all the while sort of like investigating the threat of this werewolf monster in the woods.
And The Interrobangers follows a group of kids that might look pretty familiar to you if you've ever seen Scooby-Doo or The Young Adventures of Scooby-Doo, that show as well. But it follows four kids and a dog as they reunite and try to figure out just what's going on in the woods outside of their weird upstate New York little village.
Yeah, so we wanted to start by talking a little bit about how these plays interact with the elements of the kids on bike genre that we talked about a little bit a couple of weeks ago, beginning with the kids. So in the Interrobangers, you see both the gang, we'll call them in honor of the fact that like they map pretty cleanly onto Scooby-Doo archetypes, both at 12 years old, investigating, the local like guy who was dressed up in a mask and meddling and doing terrible crimes. And you also see them reunite at 18 in their senior year of high school. So you get that sort of like perspective on how they've changed, how they've evolved, while still sort of being like somewhat restricted to their small town and somewhat like kind of bound by like the limitations that like children and teenagers have on their lives. And then in Wolfcrush, you see four teenagers, four high schoolers who are sort of seem honestly pretty free to do whatever they want. But there is this sort of looming outside threat, this looming sort of danger of the wolf in the woods, and also sort of just like the social dangers and the complicated sort of nature of their relationships with each other. In place of bikes, we see in the Interrobangers they have a van that one of the characters has sort of customized. That is their sort of mystery machine, you could say.
It's very groovy.
It's extremely groovy,
which is very nice, and ends up being named the Interrobanger, I believe. Yeah, which was a nice touch.
Yeah. But otherwise, I will acknowledge that in these plays that we do think are kids on bikes plays, no bikes, no bikes,
but like kids,
like the spirit of bikes.
Yes.
In terms of like monsters, you have the werewolf in Wolfcrush, and then the sort of like mystery at play in the Interrobangers is both this kind of question of like aliens and like otherworldly forces, as well as the Foggy Bluffs monster, which is sort of like the notable, famous, infamous question mark cryptid of their town, sort of like the thing that their town is really well known for.
Yeah, could be a ghost of a colonist, could be a weird creature in the woods with wings on its back, maybe, question mark, could be some aliens, could be all three.
Yeah. And the monsters really explicitly, I think, play in the Interrobangers and in Wolfcrush, because in the Interrobangers, I think it's fair to call him the protagonist, Zodiac, was abducted by these aliens and went away for a long time. And the sort of occasion that like begins the play is him coming back to that small town and going back to high school there and sort of getting the gang back together, as it were. but a lot of the play is sort of exploring, you know, what impact did this have on him? How do you solve this mystery that is so like foundational to his life? That of course, like nobody believes his story. And then in Wolfcrush, you know,
well, there's the new kid in town.
Yeah, you have the new kid in town
that we might view as like the powered character.
Mm-hmm.
If we want to map the kids on bikes vibe onto this more.
Yeah, I think Junus is definitely like a powered character sort of trope. Like she's very much like take no shit. Like I'm going to do what I'm going to do sort of energy. This is maybe a tiny bit of a spoiler, but I also don't think we can talk about this play without just saying explicitly, like it turns out that two of the teenagers are werewolves. Like the werewolves were the friends we made along the way.
Well, and I think what was really exciting for me was the werewolves themselves being unknown to each other.
Yes.
Like this isn't someone turns someone else into a werewolf sort of vibe. It's like a werewolf has been here, a werewolf has moved here, and turf lines are drawn a little bit. Mm-hmm. But I think the second reveal of there being two wolves is something that's very exciting. Like, I think that both of these plays inhabit this really cool, as someone who, you know, both of us have screamed to put more ghosts in your plays, you cowards. These plays both do that and were written before we started yelling at people about that. So kudos to both Sloth and Haygen-Brice for doing that. But like, both of these plays are very much my shit. Mm-hmm. I know that you had sent me Wolfcrush forever ago and you were like, this is your shit, you should read it. Other people also reached out to me when they had discovered this play and they were like, Todd, this is a you play. And the Interrobangers, I had been looking for like weird Halloween plays sort of vibes. And Sloth's play was put on my radar and I was really glad to get to read it for this episode. Because I think it's a really fascinating piece that explores both like genre and in fun ways. I think often people are afraid of doing plays like this because you feel like you have to do so much explaining. And I think both of these plays do something interesting. And I'm sorry, we're getting off track, but both of these plays do something interesting in that they like rely on tropes that we know about. Mm-hmm. So they don't have to do a lot of the explaining and the world building that I think a lot of more fantastic plays do. Mm-hmm. Like in the opening of the Interrobangers, we hear the gang as they're like getting ready to do the trap and like lights come up on someone in a spooky outfit suspended, I think upside down by their foot, maybe, after being put through some like elaborate trap that I'm sure involved a washing machine being used as a weight for a thing, which is great. And we like immediately know that we're in Scooby-Doo, and that's lovely. And in Wolfcrush, while the town reacts like many werewolf movies do, where they're like, we have no idea what could be mauling all of these people in the woods. We, the audience who know these tropes, are like, there's a fucking werewolf here. And so the play doesn't need to spend a lot of time being like, werewolves are real. It's just like, yeah, we're in this genre. That's cool.
Yeah. And also, I think both of these, like, I think that's the brilliance of the Kids on Bike genre, because I think it's what it's doing is making the familiar feel a little bit unfamiliar, but that also is predicated on like this being something really familiar and accessible to us inherently. And I think it helps that both of these plays are telling a story that is like separate from like the monsters and the spooks and the ghosts and all of these things. Like, I think, I will talk about this a little more later, but I think both plays are like very much using that to tell a specific kind of story, such that like I'm so invested in what that story is, like what's going on between these four teenagers, what's going on, what relationships are forming, what discoveries about oneself are being made, all of these things that like my energy is being spent on that, not on like, is this monster real? Like, tell me more about the monster. Like all of these things. But I also think the way that these plays engage with like authority figures is different they're very different from each other, and they're really interesting. In Wolfcrush, the like adult characters are ridiculous, like objectively just like bizarre, absolutely bizarre people. And if I remember correctly, they're all played by one person, which I think is like helpful in terms of like, you know, this is like the face, you know, the authority figure who, you know, is blustery and weird and aggressive and like absolutely not to be taken seriously, and stands kind of in sharp contrast to the kids or the teenagers who are like feel very real and very like less exaggerated.
It feels a little like Spring Awakening too, where like all of the adults are just the two. Like all dads are the same dad, even though they're different characters, and like all moms are the same mom in that play, because to the teens, all authority figures are the same.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really useful lens that the play is employing to like show you where your focus is, which I think is nifty.
Yeah. Yeah. And then in the Interrobangers, you see kind of these like different levels of authority. And I think there is a lot of question about like what beyond age makes someone an authority figure, like what, like what's going on there. And I think the play is also really explicitly engaging with questions of like law enforcement and like the state and all of these things in a way that I think is really interesting. And that it is also kind of a hallmark of like the kids on bike genre in terms of like questioning what function they serve, what they're actually doing, what they are attempting to preserve, all of these things. I
also like that in the Interrobangers, while we do have the police, who also Hank, who's very much Freddy, Hank's mom is the sheriff. So that's like one level of authority, but also there's this mysterious figure, Mr. Doll, who like might be an alien or might be some weird CIA agent. Like it's never made explicit one way or the other, seems to have authority over the police in a way that even the police don't agree with. And I can imagine a game of Kids on Bikes where you played as Tess, Hank's mom, and interacted with this weird figure that like also could pull rank on you, in ways that it's not like just the kids. It's also the adults are contending with something here.
Yeah. The last sort of element of genre that I wanted to talk a little bit about is like the stories that these are both telling, which I think will bridge us nicely beyond genre elements. But I think they're both engaging with the question of like a coming of age story in interesting ways. The Interrobangers very much explores how things shift over time. Like, for example, what had been like a pizza place in the present day is now like a vegan diner. You see sort of like the separation of a friend group and what happens when they come back together. Like there's a line from Zodiac that I think encapsulates this really well. He says, it's like everything is mostly the same, yet not at all. Like it's an oil painting and I remember a cartoon. And I really, really love that. And I think that that's engaging with the question of coming of age in a really interesting sort of inside out way. Because it's so much less, I think, about like directly like the characters changing and more about like what they learn about how they have changed, you know?
Yeah. Wolfcrush feels much more to me like a queer but traditional like sexual coming of age story. Like it is about the characters entering into new relationships for the first time,
about their spring awakenings, as it were.
Yeah. And there's like a romantic and lusty aspect to it that, while there is a little romance in the Interrobangers that is also like fun and queer, it's very chaste. Whereas
there's like multiple sex scenes in Wolfcrush.
There's multiple sex scenes in Wolfcrush, some of which are also like
fucked up.
Yeah, and it's not that the sex is the sex is fucked up, but it's not because it's sex. It's because it's like what the people are doing in addition to sex.
No spoilers, but like it's intense.
It's intense. I remember reading the part with is it Janice?
Yeah, like Junus, I think.
Junus. The scene with her and her X-Acto blade for the first time, and I was like, what in the world am I reading? So look forward to that, readers. But it's a really cool, weird play that I very much enjoyed.
Well, and I think it's like, I think what it's doing is like very much sort of subverting audience and like reader expectations of like what a coming of age story is supposed to entail. And like, I think pushing really hard back against the sort of like chaste and sanitized way a lot of these stories are told in media, because I think like that's a big part of coming of age. Not necessarily, you know, like fucking a werewolf in the woods, but, you know, like I think like coming of age does have a lot to do with like sex and relationships. And I think like we don't see that. Particularly, I think a lot of queer stories are sanitized because of like reasons that are self-evident to me and that we won't necessarily like dig deep into. But like, I think it's really cool and exciting to see a play that is like unapologetically like, this is gay.
Yeah.
And this is this is part of what queerness is.
Yeah. In some ways, in thinking about like in this description of it, it feels like, if I hope this doesn't upset anyone or whatever, or like belittle the play, because I don't think that this is a bad thing, but it's like a tragic American Pie. Like American Pie is like a messy coming of age story that is funny, and this is a messy one that's not. In terms of like sex and sexuality. Yeah.
It is an extremely funny play, but also, yeah, it's like,
it is a very funny play.
It's unsettling.
I feel like the moments of sexual intimacy are not all funny, haha, and
they are
sometimes like, oh geez, in ways that are, I mean, Haygen-Brice is doing something interesting there. I think he's like tapping into some ideas about queer shame and also some ideas about like body image and stuff like that, that are very interesting. There's a lot of funny things in this play. It's just, those are not those moments.
Correct.
because those aren't always funny.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the thing that I think he's pushing back against is this expectation that like queer love and queer sex looks like what we see in, you know, film and TV, and like that, you know, that it has to, or this expectation that it always has to be perfect and idyllic, when in reality, like for various reasons, that's not the case. Yeah.
Shifting gears a little bit, looking at the world building of these plays, there's definitely something in both Wolfcrush and the Interrobangers about this like looming presence of the woods, both as a place that's like sort of in a fable sort of way, where like the law and order of the city or the town don't really exist here. Like things can be transgressed here, which is often what you see in a lot of fable and folklore. Like the woods are places where weird things happen. And in these plays, that's true of both. And so like we have both the woods in the Interrobangers specifically, we have the fog that rolls in and out, and then these monsters that are in the woods. And I think something that Wolfcrush does, but Interrobangers doesn't really broach, is addressing or like comparing monstrous qualities to queerness. In ways that I think are interesting and not demonizing, but not pretty.
Like, I think it taps into the phenomenon of like, so many Disney villains are queer coded, but also as a queer person, I identify most closely with a lot of them. Like, I think in a lot of queer communities, or for a lot of queer people, there is like an embrace of otherness and monstrosity in like a subversive way. And I think that's kind of what Wolfcrush is doing, in terms of just being like, yeah, you know what? I am a werewolf. Fuck you. Like,
yeah. Well, and like, I also found it very fascinating that Interrobangers doesn't. Like, Interrobangers is very queer, but the queerness isn't really related to the the weirdness, except I guess, and I know there's a quote that you put in that Luna has about this like interplay between, I felt like in at no point are we led to believe that like whatever is in the woods and Foggy Bluffs, it is not inherently queer, nor is it making people queer or anything like that. And like there is a specific queerness to the werewolves in Wolfcrush.
Yeah, I think it's the difference between, like, I think what Wolfcrush is doing is saying like there is a monstrosity inherent to queerness that you can't ignore, and also that's not a bad thing necessarily. And I think what Interrobangers is saying, which I think is like interesting separate from that, is as Luna says, like queerness is about understanding that these other things are real, and queerness is sort of the way that you can access that, and like the reason that you might believe in otherworldly possibilities, because queerness puts you into this kind of in-between space already. Like I'll read a little bit of the quote because it's very long. But they say, I'm learning there's an interplay between being queer and believing in magic, in monsters, aliens, ghosts. And they talk about like their sort of in-between place in terms of gender, and like how that sort of relates to belief in like the supernatural and the paranormal and all of these things. Which I think is different, but like equally interesting to me. Yeah.
Cutting back to like the way these plays are built and the worlds within them are built. I liked in the Interrobangers, they talk about the puppetry and stagecraft, specifically around Hoover or Hoove, the dog, which I thought was interesting. Sloth describes that like you could have a real dog that is trained,
a professional dog, which is a very good phrase.
You could have Hoove be a puppet of some sort. And I have Shannon, who you all will meet shortly in our Oh Dang, Bigfoot Stole My Car playthrough, has done these like large scale puppets that are very like, I can imagine how Hoove could work in that situation and not in just this abstract, like a puppet will fix that. But did this like really incredible both construction of a puppet and puppetry at the Rose Theater with this show called Prancer about a reindeer. And so like I can imagine how something like that could be Hoove and could work. But also there's questions about like shadow puppetry and an idea that Hoove is both like real and an idea at different points in the play. And how you theatrically construct that. I also think like I have so many questions about what the ideal version of Wolfcrush looks like.
Yes.
Because some of the transformations happen on stage. Some of them don't. We see someone fully wolf mode, but do we see that transition fully on stage?
Yeah. And then we see it a couple of times. Okay. And there's also just a lot of like very graphic moments of violence.
Yes.
Like it is a gory play. And yeah, like this is a tangent that I'm going to unapologetically take us on, which is that the thing that occurred to me as I was reading Wolfcrush is that it feels a lot like a lyric game in terms of its...
Tell me more.
It feels like, I don't want to wade necessarily into like what is a lyric game discourse, but I think like this is a play that does a lot of its work in your experience of reading it. Like I think because like he plays a lot with different fonts, and like there's like you know, the stage specifically the stage directions are like so integral to understanding the tone of the play and like the experience that the playwright wants you to have. And like a lot of them are moments that don't feel playable in like the specific, like there's no way that you're necessarily going to get exactly what he is communicating in that stage direction unless you literally just like read what it says, you know? But it's just like, it's interesting to me how evocative this play is on the page. And I think it would feel completely different if you were to watch it, not in like a bad way, but I think they're just like, it's interesting to me, that relationship is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I'm so sad that I haven't seen this play done. I would want to do it.
Cowards.
Well, but some people have. And I'm sad I haven't been in a place where I could see it, because part of me wants to produce Wolfcrush and part of me is terrified of producing Wolfcrush, which is I don't know how to make it feel the way I think the play wants to feel. Like, there's some really exciting stage moments here that I'm like, I just don't know how to do this personally in a way that feels satisfying, but I want it to feel satisfying if I'm going to do this.
Yeah. It's so fascinating. It's so complicated. And then I think, which like stands very sharply in contrast to Sloth, who is just sort of like, this is all constructed. Like, this is Scooby-Doo bullshit. And like, and the fact that like they explicitly say in like the notes, like these should be different things. They should not be like one consistent thing. So you have these sort of like larger than life moments, but I feel like the play supports them in a way that is different than the way like Wolfcrush's moments feel. Like, I think, yeah, I guess mostly what it is that, yeah, like in the Interrobangers, Sloth is really explicit about like, this is how it should feel. And this is like what, you know, this is how to do this thing. Whereas I think in Wolfcrush, like there is this sort of like, I feel like it has to feel real. Mm-hmm. Whereas like in the Interrobangers, there is like, because the first encounter that we have is the kids like unmasking, insert terrible white man here. Mm-hmm. Like the interplay of like what's real and what's constructed is sort of set up for us at the very beginning. And you're sort of able to be like, okay, like these are real threats. But we're also in a world where like things can feel man-made or things don't have to be realistic.
It doesn't need to be realistic to be real.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Thank you.
And I think that's like most funnily portrayed through Hoove.
Yes.
Like there's moments where, as I was reading it, I was going back and forth between like, would I have a puppet for this or would I want a real dog, a professional dog for this situation? I just think
the phrase professional dog is so funny.
It's great. There were moments where I could see like this one working better in this situation, that one working better in that situation. And like who's running it, like who's puppeteering it was a question that I had a bunch. Like, are those members of the ensemble or is this a different puppeteer? Were things that I thought about. But at no point during Wolfcrush did I have feelings about like how realistic or how theatrical is this? Because I feel like it wants to be as real as possible. And I think that that's part of the spectacle of it. Mm-hmm. Like, I think Wolfcrush probably works less well if, Beecher, spoiler, turns into a werewolf by like donning a wolf, like constructed wireframe sort of like armature over his head. I don't think that that's as exciting as what we're looking for. And I think like somehow he must become a wolf in a way that is like visceral and not just theatrical. And I think that that's exciting. I just don't know how to do it. And I want to know how to do it.
Yeah. It's like a thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently because one of my playwriting professors has been nagging me about writing stage directions without explaining how to do them. But I do think it like those two camps of playwriting fascinate me. The camp of like, I'm going to give you some hints about like what this should feel like and like how you might accomplish this versus like, this is what it is. Figure it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I've been there. Like in Emily Dickinson, Paranormal Investigator, I describe characters as levitating sometimes. I describe magic that happens on stage. And like at the beginning of the play, I have some notes on like, I don't know, you could do it like this way or this way or this way. And I don't really care as long as it feels cool to you. But like, that's not what's important to me in the moment. What's important is like, she's flying, whatever that means.
Yeah. Like I have stage directions, like the castle folds in half like a storybook and closes and then leaves him on stage, whatever.
Yeah.
My professor was like, how do you do that? And I was like, I don't know. Figure it out. But yeah, it's like, well, and to sort of like bring us back to like the genre, I think the Kids on Bike genre is so much about feeling, which is why I think Wolfcrush is a fascinating example, because I think like all of the things that happen in the play are so visceral and driven by feeling and driven by like gut audience responses to what's happening, that like, yeah, like that is the central thing, is that it has to make you feel the way like reading the play on the page makes you feel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Like, yeah, I don't remember how we got to where we are, but here we are. Actually, related to that, the big question that I had as I was prepping for this episode, and I was reading both plays, is like, what are these plays each saying about the nature of monsters and the role of monsters in our world? And like, what is different or similar about what they are saying about monsters?
I mean, I think for me, as we were saying before, like Wolfcrush addresses the monstrous feeling that queer people have in their adolescence. Guillermo del Toro did this exhibition called At Home with Monsters. And he has like a collection of like monster movie stuff, but is also like a monster movie buff. And if I'm remembering correctly, there's a quote at the beginning that's either his or it's someone else's. And if it's someone else's, I'll make sure that we put it in the show notes. So sorry. But he describes this feeling of not seeing yourself represented in media and feeling monstrous because of that. Mm-hmm. Like, if you are not the white, skinny, heterosexual hero in these movies, then you must be Swamp Thing, or you must be the Wolf Man, or you must be these other things. And I feel like Wolfcrush like takes an idea like that as inspiration and weaponizes it.
Yeah.
Very much to your like, yeah, I'm a wolf, fuck you.
Exactly.
Sort of feeling. And I think that that's a really fascinating place to be. Whereas like in the quote that you read earlier from Luna in the Interrobangers, having this like more expansive view of the world that allows for ghosts and werewolves and UFOs as being part of the queer experience as well, I think is a very different like ethos.
Yeah. Well, and I think both are very queer in very different ways in terms of like, I'm not going to attempt to quote it because I don't want to misquote her, but there's a trans activist whose name is Kai Cheng Tom, who's like she's fucking brilliant. She rules. But she said something about, embracing monstrosity and finding power in that. And that is like a deeply queer and deeply like gendery thing. But yeah, I'm also interested, in the Interrobangers and in the way where it's sort of like, what does queerness enable you to see? The other thing that, specifically thinking about the way that the Interrobangers kind of interacts with Scooby-Doo is thinking about, circling back a little bit to our last commentary episode, the role of nostalgia, and what that is sort of doing, because I think a lot of what we talked about in our nostalgia episode, which you should listen to if you haven't, kind of comes into play here in terms of like, you see this friend group getting back together, you see this friend group sort of thinking back to like when they were younger and what their relationships with each other used to be, and like who is a skeptic, who still sort of believes in monsters and ghosts and all of these spooky things, you know, who really, really wants to get out, who really feels invested in the town. Like, what is everybody's relationship to the past and how has that changed? Is something I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, I think, thinking back to another part of our episode about that, I feel like Wolfcrush is, I hate my stupid fucking town. And the Interrobangers is like, there's something cool here though, isn't there? Yeah. In different ways. I feel like there's probably a lack of nostalgia in Wolfcrush. There isn't really a sentimentality to it.
No. And I think the Interrobangers is very much about community and is very much about like And I think it's a lot of where the queerness in the Interrobangers manifests too, aside like just in like, what are our relationships to each other and what do those relationships mean and how have they changed? And like, what happens when you find out who you can count on and who you can't, is interesting, I think. But yeah, I think you're correct that Wolfcrush is not particularly sentimental in its affect. Yeah, I think plays in the genre in general are really good at telling stories about like changing relationships to one's community and like how we as people experience change as we get older. And the like argument that I would make that we've sort of been circling around for the whole episode is like, I think the genre, like the Kids on Bikes genre, is particularly good at telling queer stories, in part because of the way queerness can be explored through notions of like reclaiming monstrosity or what your relation to monstrosity is. And because it like unlocks, I think, a lot of possibilities for exploring queer childhood. Because like, I think we do have a dearth of stories about queer teenagers and queer kids for various reasons. And I think it's really, the genre offers a really excellent way specifically to like tell stories about queer people and understand like what your relationship to queerness is as like a writer or as somebody who's like experiencing these stories.
Yeah. A play that's like very similar to the vibes of both of these plays that I enjoy is River Tim's Tall Tales, which we didn't want to discuss explicitly or like focus on as much in this episode because it's not about kids. But there is this aspect of like mid-20s coming home to your rural, like small town vibe and something monstrous happening. And that being specifically tied to queerness. In Tall Tales, a character who has kind of like left college and is trying to figure out their life a little bit, moves home and reconnects with someone that they probably had feelings for when they were younger, but they were never really a thing. And then this creature that seems to be like animated from the gossip in town starts like haunting not only them, but the small town itself. And it's a really exciting and fascinating play that explores, again, like queer stories, monstrous stories, and also this like small town vibe that we felt in the nostalgia episode that this like Kids on Bikes genre really gelled with, telling these supernatural in small town.
Yeah. Well, and like it, like this is why you should put more ghosts in your plays, you cowards, because like it's such a good way to think about like how bigotry manifests or how queerness manifests or how, you know, what is the relation of like people in a town to the state, to what are the forces at work. Like, I think monsters are such an effective tool for like thinking about what we demonize and what we don't culturally. So like put more monsters in your plays, because also monsters are cool. Like I'm speaking with passion only because I like feel a lot of kinship with the genre for various reasons, but largely like I think there's a reason that we tell so many coming of age stories. And I think it's because like a lot of people have some kind of relationship to these kinds of stories. Like I think a lot of people can in some way relate to the experience of like being in your senior year of high school and realizing, oh, I've grown apart from people that I used to really love. What does that mean? Yeah, I think there's so many like rich depths that we all sort of have to explore through experiencing stories like these, particularly queer people.
Well, so this is also like thinking about how you were talking about like using monsters to tell stories about society, which many of them are. Like very rarely is a werewolf film about turning into a wolf. That's not what they're actually about. But it reminded me of this movie that I watched last year that fits into this genre, not in a queer way, but in a kids on bikes way. I know. Well, it's called Vampires versus the Bronx.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if you've seen this. It's a delight. But the vampires are gentrifiers. They're literally like trying to gentrify the Bronx. And sometimes this means they're like literally sucking the blood of the community to get people out of their way. And other times it's like, oh no, there's a bougie new cafe where our bodega used to be. But using these vampires as a metaphor to tell stories about gentrification, I think is like an interesting mode for us to go in. Certainly not as much as I love telling queer ghost stories. But I think that there's something very fascinating in using monsters to tell stories about our society and where we are.
Yeah, like in particular, because I think similar to the way the Interrobangers like does a lot of interesting things theatrically with how you represent those monsters on stage. Like, I think there is a lot of really exciting opportunity to sort of poke at like what is real and what is not. And I also think it's not just the monsters that allow you to do that, but in this genre, I also think it's like the fact that the heroes are not law enforcement or, you know, agents of the state or what have you. It's the kids. Like it's, you know, it's the underdogs. It's like in Wolfcrush, the authority figures are fucking useless. Like, yeah, there's no, that like they're nothing. They don't do anything. They actively get in the way. If anything. And I think stories like that are appealing to people who feel like they have in some way been failed by like the criminal justice system or have been failed by law enforcement or don't feel like the systems that these monsters are threatening actually do anything for them or like account for them in the way that they function. So I do think also like these are really excellent ways to explore sort of broader like questions of who has agency and who has power and who, you know, who is the one who can actually make a change or defeat the monster or do whatever. Yeah. Like I think that's another reason they're a really good vehicle for telling stories, because I certainly don't think that anybody is going to take them at face value. I don't think anybody could watch Wolfcrush and be like, oh, what a lovely, what a play about American werewolves. Exactly. What a play about werewolves and nothing else. Like, I don't think anyone is watching the Interrobangers and being like, I can't even think of what they would take away, because it's so obviously about queerness and so obviously about queer community and so obviously about, you know, the relation between queerness and the supernatural. So yeah.
As we've said before, folks, put ghosts in your place, you goddamn cowards.
I'm a wolf. Fuck you. Dungeons and Drama Nerds is produced by Todd Brian Backus, Percival Hornak, and Nicholas Orvis, and is mixed and edited by Anthony Sertel Dean. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at DN Drama Nerds. Check out cast bios on our website, dungeonsanddramanerds.com, and tune in next week for another episode of Dungeons and Drama Nerds.